so this meeting will be live streamed. There it is. And Your Worship, you're good to proceed.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Good evening, everyone, members of council, staff, and public who are joining us this evening for this special council meeting dealing with the zoning amendments. So with that, I will call the meeting to order and start with number 3, which is the special council agenda. And that the agenda of the special council meeting of February 23, 2022 be approved as presented. Could I have a mover and a seconder? Councillor LaRose, Councillor Cummings, all in favor? And that is carried. Thank you. If anyone has a declaration of pecuniary interest, they may do so now or at the appropriate time. It would be dealt with. Moving on to number 5, it is as stated, a public meeting dealing with the consideration of the town's zoning bylaw to all lands pertaining within the town of Penetanguishene. So to council, the purpose of this public meeting is not to engage in a debate regarding the merits of the application, nor is it intended to be a question and answer session. It is to provide an opportunity for the public to make comments and for council members to ask clarifying questions. And to the public, it is your opportunity to speak in support or in opposition of this application based on planning merits, and we encourage you to do so. In accordance with the Planning Act, if a person does not make an oral submission to the public meeting or make written submissions before the bylaw is passed or approved, given you may not be entitled to appeal the decision of the local planning appeal tribunal, and you may not be added as decision to the local planning appeal tribunal, and you may not be added as a party to a hearing on an appeal to the LPAT unless, in the opinion of the LPAT, there is reasonable grounds to do so. And with that, I would ask our planner, Owen, to proceed with the zoning amendment.
Thank you, Your Worship. The zoning bylaw review project was initiated first in May of 2019 with the retention of Meridian Planning Consultants to prepare a new zoning bylaw that will completely replace the old zoning bylaw in conjunction with the approval of our new official plan back in 2019 as well. The zoning bylaw review was guided by the steering committee, which was composed of 2 members of council, 2 members of the community, staff, and consultants from Meridian Planning. Most recently, at the Committee of the Whole meeting in December, the first draft of the bylaw was presented and recommended to be released to the public for public comments. Notice of this meeting was provided throughout January and February, along with an open house. Notice was provided to all of the prescribed agencies and organizations, as well as members through the public through our social media channels, as well as utilizing Connect Penetanguishene and hosting a number of weekly virtual events where residents have the opportunity to meet with staff and ask questions. With that, I would invite Allison from Meridian Planning, with your permission, Your Worship, to provide a presentation for the public meeting.
Thank you, Owen. And yes, Allison, if you would, please.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time to join us tonight. Your feedback is valuable, and we look forward to any comments that you may have to offer. And with that, Owen, if we could just pull up the presentation. Very good. So again, this is a statutory public meeting for the zoning bylaw review update. Next slide, please. So what I will do is just very briefly set a little bit of context here. As Owen outlined, we have had a number of public engagement opportunities But in the event that we do have a few new people joining on stream, I'll just quickly cover off that context for you. So the current zoning bylaw was adopted by council over 20 years ago and has regulated land use within the town since January of 2000. As you can imagine, a lot has changed over the last 20 years, including an increase in population, changing demographics, evolving land use trends, and a number of the legislative requirements at the provincial and county level have gone through numerous iterations. And that includes the town, who had their new official plan approved by the county in 2019. So one of the primary responsibilities of the zoning bylaw is to actually implement the policies of that official plan. So on the heels of approval of the OP, the town of Penetanguishene initiated a review of the comprehensive zoning bylaw, which is the project that we're reviewing now today. Next slide, please. So this briefly gives you an outline of where we've come and where we're aiming to be. Of course, in 2019, COVID hit, and so that has affected the timeline somewhat. But in December, just a few months ago, we were in phase 3. We completed the first public draft of the new zoning bylaw and presented that to the committee of the whole. Since that time, we have held the 2 public open houses, and we are now holding the statutory public meeting tonight. Following our meeting tonight, we will review any and all feedback we have from the public and make any appropriate changes to the draft bylaw. That will then come back to the committee of the whole in April, with council adoption targeted for the end of the second quarter of this year, so certainly by May or June. Next slide, please. So very basically and quickly, the goals of the project, of course, was the official plan conformity. And as Owen had already mentioned, we have taken the approach of repeal and replace. So that means that the existing bylaw will be repealed in its entirety and replaced with the new bylaw. And the new bylaw will do a few key things. It will be updated to reflect more contemporary terminology and best practices in zoning. It will address any outstanding issues that have emerged over the years with the current zoning, so places where staff have identified there to be gaps in regulations. And we've strived to make the new bylaw a little bit more user-friendly, to improve the ease of reference, to access the terminology using plain language, and to find the information within the document itself. Next slide, please. So this very quickly is just the key features of the new document, and I just wanted to highlight a few key things for you here. One of the new features is the preamble that we've added up front, which is essentially a user guide on how to use the bylaw. That preamble does not constitute part of the legal document. Rather, it is just designed to help a reader who's not familiar with planning to identify how to locate their zoning, how to understand what uses are permitted and what the regulations on their lot would be. The remainder of the sections of the bylaw, the first 2 sections there are really the operative sections of the bylaw, so administration and the zone structure. That covers off the framework and things such as enforcement. And then those middle sections, definition, general provisions, and parking and loading, those are provisions that apply to all lands within the town. They're generally use-specific provisions. In the case of the general provisions, they deal with things like landscaping requirements where they are required, home occupations, accessory structures, that sort of thing. And the parking and loading is a little bit different from what we have in the existing bylaw, in the sense that we have put all of those requirements in one section. So whether it's what the parking standard is, where parking must be located on the lot, things like drive-throughs, accessible parking, bicycle parking, that's now all in one spot and much more easily accessed. And then finally, there are the various permitted use tables and zone standards for each individual zone that correspond to the zone that's applied to the properties. Next slide, please. So the map you see on the right-hand side there is an excerpt of the zone schedule or map. And a few things that, to highlight there is that that schedule is both color coded and it has labels on it. So for example, where you see yellow, that would be indicative of a residential zone. And if you were able to zoom in, you would see that it would either be labeled R1 for residential 1 or R2 for residential 2. So those are some of the user-friendly features that we've incorporated. We now have 5 zone categories that are spread across the town. You see them there on the screen in front of you: residential, mixed-use commercial. All the shoreline zones have been put in one spot, one section, which is different from the existing bylaw. Employment zones, and then we have a category of other zones, which are essentially the one-off singular zones. Next slide, please, Owen. So this explains that with a little bit more detail. I want to take a moment and talk about the residential zones because that's where a lot of the bigger changes are within this bylaw. So the existing bylaw has many residential zones, and the distinction between the existing residential zones is very minor. So the difference between one to the next residential zone is cumbersome given the number of zones that were now within the existing bylaw. So what we've done is we have been able to collapse that down. So there's essentially 3 urban residential zones in the town now, which is your R1, 2, and 3 zone. The residential land lease community zones that you see at the bottom of that column there, they are very site specific. They only apply in very limited fashion to very specific properties. The mixed use and commercial zones are pretty much as you would expect in looking at that chart there. So the neighborhood commercial zones are those commercial zones that serve the immediate area within a residential area. Your mixed use commercial are the commercial zones along arterial roads, and then the downtown and waterfront zone. The shoreline zones, as I said, have all been grouped into the new bylaw. So the shoreline area 1 and area 2 zones really have not changed very much at all from what's existing, nor have the marina 1 or 2. They have essentially been carried over from the existing bylaw, and the terminology has been updated where required to be a little bit more contemporary, but they really haven't changed all that much. The employment zones, you now have only one employment zone within the town, which is really the industrial M1 zone. And then the other 2 are your rural employment zones, being extractive and rural industrial, extractive being aggregates. And finally, that last column of other zones, that's where we have our one-off zones. So institutional, rural, open space, environmental protection, and the deferred development zone. And I wanted to speak to that one just a little bit. The deferred development zone has been applied to lands that have been earmarked for development at some point in the future. So this zone is essentially a placeholder. So the deferred development zone itself does not grant any development permissions. If at such time as those lands were needed, a zoning bylaw amendment and a plan of subdivision or other planning application will still be needed to actually permit development, but the deferred development zone itself just earmarks that for that future development. Next slide, please. So there are a few key highlights that we wanted to focus in on tonight to make sure that we communicated that to the members of the public. And that is surrounding additional dwelling units, short-term rentals, and accessory shoreline structures. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is an additional dwelling unit? An additional dwelling unit is a dwelling unit that is subordinate to the primary dwelling unit on a lot. So in other words, what we would otherwise have referred to as an accessory apartment or a basement apartment, that essentially is what an additional dwelling unit is. They operate as a singular housekeeping unit. They're completely standalone and independent in terms of how they function. So they have their own sleeping accommodations, own sanitary facilities, bathrooms, kitchens, and living areas. Next slide, please. So these additional dwelling units are mandated by the province. This was brought into being through legislation in 2019. where the province required municipalities to permit additional dwelling units, dwelling units in official plans and zoning bylaws. So these are now required to be permitted in detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, and townhouse dwellings, as well as in accessory buildings. So to be clear, what this means now is that for residential lots that have those types of dwellings on them, there is a possible 3 residential units that may occur on a property. Importantly, to bring to the attention of the public that there is no appeal mechanism for this policy or the zoning instruments that implement the policy, as this is provincially mandated and it is a provincial requirement. So once adopted by council, there is no appeal mechanism on this specific aspect of the bylaw. Next slide, please. So these are just some examples of how this could be configured on a lot. So if you look at the left-hand side in the upper corner, that is what would normally be a basement apartment configuration. So the primary unit or the main dwelling unit is on the upper floor with the additional dwelling unit in the basement. Just to the right of that is the inverse scenario. So the primary dwelling unit is on the ground level, and then that additional dwelling unit is above ground. If you go down to the bottom row, this on the left-hand side just shows where perhaps the dwelling unit is configured in such a way that there's a portion that juts out that nicely compartmentalizes another additional dwelling unit there. So it can be to the side there, but important to note in that particular scenario that they are all in the same structure and connected. And then to the right of that is where the additional dwelling unit is permitted in an accessory structure. And in the zoning bylaw, we are only permitted that in accessory structures in the rear yard. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the key highlights in the zoning approach. So permitted, it permits an additional dwelling unit in a main building on a residential lot or in a detached accessory building, is permitted in a detached, semi-detached, or townhouse dwelling. An additional dwelling unit must be located on a municipally maintained street, is only permitted where servicing capacity is available to accommodate the additional dwelling unit or units. The town will be requiring an occupancy permit in order to permit this. The parking requirements were also provincially mandated. So one parking space per additional dwelling unit is required in addition to the parking for the primary unit. And that parking may be provided in a tandem form. So all that really means is one behind the other. We have put in place some maximum size provisions. So the maximum size in the zoning will be for the additional dwelling unit will be 45% of the main building or primary dwelling, up to a maximum of 55 square meters if it is within the primary dwelling, or up to a maximum of 60 square meters if it's in an accessory building. And then finally, there are a few other regulations that I'd already touched on, but location being in the rear yard, the height is a maximum 4.5 meters, which is the same and standard to all accessory buildings in the town, and the size maximums that I just spoke to. Next slide, please. So still looking within residential areas, but now we're making the pivot from additional dwelling units, which are longer term occupancy, to short-term rentals. So a short-term rental is a dwelling unit that's not occupied as a primary residence, but is made available for short-term rentals with the intention of financial compensation. So while the town is looking at this short-term rentals through the draft bylaw, it is also examining this through a licensing bylaw that's authorized under the Municipal Act. These two processes are running parallel in the town at this time, so they will work in conjunction with each other. Next slide, please. So there are a few different ways that this can be done. The town can choose to permit short-term rentals as of right in a particular zone, or they may require it through a zoning bylaw amendment process or a combination thereof. What is being recommended at this time is that short-term rentals be permitted as of right in the downtown and waterfront zone. This is a modification to the earlier draft where they were being recommended to be permitted in the residential 1 and residential 2 zone. So my understanding is that earlier in this process that it was thought that that is where that they would be better suited in the town. However, in working with the project team and in receiving some comments from the public, we have pivoted on that recommendation and are now suggesting that they be permitted as of right in the downtown and waterfront zones, and they would be permitted by through a zoning bylaw amendment process elsewhere in the town. That's the recommendation moving forward at this point tonight. Next slide, please. So some of the key highlights here are that short-term rentals would only be permitted in a detached dwelling. That's the principal building on the lot. They would only be permitted on a lot fronting on an open and municipally maintained street. They would be only permitted on a lot with full municipal services. There would be a maximum of 4 permitted guest rooms. They would not be permitted in a detached accessory building, in a recreational vehicle parked in a residential zone, or in a tent or other similar temporary structure on the property. And they would not be permitted in conjunction with, for example, a granny suite or a garden suite or any other use that would essentially intensify the use further. So at this point in time, with the short-term rentals, both the official plan and the zoning bylaw are silent on these uses. And it is now time that we bring some kind of guidance and regulation into play for these uses. Next slide, please. Okay, so making another pivot then to that final issue. These are shoreline structures. This was something that was of interest in some of our earlier public meetings, and so we're bringing this forward for a little bit more discussion now. Shoreline structures refer to accessory buildings and structures that are erected at or near the shoreline, and they're located between the shoreline and the principal dwelling on the lot, so the shoreline and the cottage, if that's the case, or the house. And we've characterized them in 2 ways: as land-based shoreline structures, which would include a freestanding platform, gazebo, sauna, hot tub, or as water-based shoreline structures, which would be boathouses, a boat port, a dock, a boat lift, and so on. With the water-based structures, even though they may engage with the water, they are attached to the shoreline or project from the shoreline. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to, I guess, set some context here in terms of what are the existing zoning requirements for these uses in the town currently, to give an understanding of where some of the changes are being proposed. Currently, shoreline structures must be set back 15 meters from the 100-year flood line, which in Penetanguishene and, well, Georgian Bay actually is measured at 178 meters. GSC is essentially above sea level is what that is. So that 15-meter setback currently exists. Right now, only 1 dock is permitted on a lot to a maximum length of 30 meters. And there is a 5-meter side yard setback from the side lot lines that is currently required in the zoning. Next slide, please. So in taking the direction for the new zoning bylaw, we did look at the policy in the official plan, and the policies that direct some of this zoning are found in 3 different spots pertaining to the environment, to hazard land policies, and shoreline area policies. In particular with the natural environment, some of the key policies are to enhance the protection of the town shoreline, to minimize impacts from climate change, to protect water quality and quantity, in this case of surface waters primarily, and to maintain natural shorelines and revegetate these areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of the hazard land policies, these are very much directed actually from provincial requirements for flood lines. The 15-meter setback is contained within the official plan, and it's 15 meters from the limit of the hazard. That word hazard actually is also defined provincially and has provincial implications. But that 15 meters is in order to accommodate things like wave uprush and other water-related hazards. And finally, in terms of hazards, the official plan directs that development shall be directed away from areas within or adjacent to flooding hazards, which again triggers that 100-meter flood line. Next slide, please. And finally, the shoreline area policy, which actually ties back to the environmental policy, but that the natural features of the shoreline area and the immediate shoreline be conserved. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with revegetating these shoreline areas and maintaining them in a natural state. Next slide, please. So that said, that is what is setting the stage for these shoreline structure zoning regulations. We will be carrying forward the 15-meter setback from the high water mark, which is identified as the 100-year flood level. We are proposing to carry forward the one dock to a maximum length of 30 meters. And we are proposing to carry forward the 5-meter setback from the side lot lines. Next slide, please. What we are proposing as new is to include provisions so that a maximum cumulative width of all accessory shoreline structures be 25% of the lot frontage as measured parallel to the shoreline. So that means that all of whatever the structures are, whether they be docks or gazebos or saunas, sum total, altogether cumulatively, they cannot occupy more than 25% of that shoreline frontage. We've also included a number of zoning provisions to regulate the number and the placement of specific structures within the shoreline. One of the comments that we did get back through the open house was, I guess, a question that could we simplify that in some way? And certainly we can take a look at that. And the project team is committed to revisiting to see how we can simplify some of those regulations. Next slide, please. So what's next? So after the meeting tonight, the project team will disappear again, and we will review and summarize all of the public comments that have been received. We will be meeting again with our steering committee in March to go through those public comments and their proposed responses or modifications to the bylaw. From there, we will be preparing the final draft of the bylaw that will come back to the Committee of the Whole in April, and then on to council adoption. Next slide, please. So if you haven't had a chance to visit the project website yet, I would encourage you to do so. Staff have done a really, really good job of getting information up on the website. It's at connectpenetangwisheen.ca / zoning bylaw review. If you have any comments that you would like to forward, or if you have a particular inquiry on your specific property, you can reach out to Owen Taylor, who is a planner with the town, and Owen's email address is there, and Owen will help you with that. Next slide, please. And then with that, I think I will pass this back over to Mayor Leroux, and we can go on to the next segment of the meeting.
Thank you, Allison. Okay, so with that, I will facilitate questions or comments from the public with responses provided from our consultant. And I would note that members of the public who are speaking would need to state their name and address for the record. So with that, Sarah, if you will, whoever is out there for questions or comment.
Your Worship, I think what we're hoping is if there are any members of the public that would like to speak, to turn on your camera or unmute yourself and just make that known. The other alternative is to write in the chat if you're more comfortable with that, and then we can bring it forward for a discussion. Okay, there you go, Your Worship. Looks like Kim would like to speak.
Okay, Kim, if you will.
Hello, everybody. I don't have anything specifically planned here as organized notes, so please bear with me. But I do just want to, I have a few points I'd like to share.
Kim, if you don't mind, to state your name and address for the record.
Oh, my apologies. So my name is Kim Bellimer, and I reside at 39 Dawn Street. Okay, and my concerns are about the Airbnb. I do have one on my street, and although the rentals there haven't been too many in the past few months, all summer long, it has not been pleasant. It hasn't been pleasant for not only me, but other members on our street. And, you know, it's caused, you know, a dent in my quiet enjoyment. I have a nice backyard and I spend time back there, and a lot of time in the summer, I couldn't spend time back there. And, you know, the amount of people that come in, I do have a concern with the fact that, you know, it's proposed that you would allow up to 8 people to come to an Airbnb, because 8 people essentially at least means 10 or more, 12, 14. And, you know, 8 might be the only amount that could sleep there, but they invite their friends, the rest of their family, and all day long. And usually they come in at 8 o'clock at night on a Sunday. And, you know, at 2 in the morning, they're still, I mean, they're there to have a good time. I understand that, but they keep carrying on well into the evening. Along with that comes fireworks, you know, loud music, a lot of hollering, you know, too many people and too many vehicles. On top of that, I am a real estate agent, and I do experience concern from a lot of people that have Airbnbs on their street, and it does decrease their value. I know it probably sounds funny talking about that in today's day, because values are really high, but an Airbnb on the street, you know, people end up finding out, and I've had buyers not want to purchase on the street because there is an Airbnb. As a resident of the town, you know, I pay tax. I don't pay tax to live beside a hotel. I pay tax to have, you know, to be in a residential area. And, you know, the Airbnbs, they make money. I get inconvenienced, or other homeowners get inconvenienced by all the nonsense that goes on in some of the Airbnbs. And the owners don't care. They're making really good money. They're just gonna, they don't care. I think that's about it. I have a couple other things, but I think I've made my point that I don't think that they're a good idea. Or maybe the good idea would be, if you want to run an Airbnb, it has to be on the same street that you live. And then maybe they would be in control. And I know you can't control that, and it's probably impossible, but that's my my thought on it.
Okay, thanks, Kim. And we will move on if there's anyone else who wishes to make comment or ask question of the consultants.
No.
Hello, Rita Bishop speaking.
Okay, Rita, go.
Yes, 21 Park Street, Penetanguishene. To Kim's comment with regards to Airbnb, I have one in my home, but it is in my home. There are guidelines that the homeowner can select if it's a residence that they don't reside at. It sounds like this homeowner that she was speaking of that has these 8 and 10 people probably needs to be spoken to with regards to respecting the neighborhood. They may or may not care. I don't know. But anyway, my question is with regards to, I think it was a change on the R1 residential attached building. I was looking for an explanation as to what classifies a granny flat. Is that like a single access to the residence and it's part of that primary residence? Is that how you would classify a granny flat?
Allison, can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I can. So a granny suite is actually a very specific land use. It's permitted specifically through the Planning Act. It is a temporary use. There's usually a minimum 10-year allowance for it. And then after 10 years, you can apply to extend that. That's something that's been in the Planning Act for many, many years. So it isn't the same, particularly as a short-term rental. The granny flats, I mean, they have been around for 20 plus years, but they literally were intended for, if you have a senior, an elderly parent who you needed to bring onto the property for a temporary period of time, it gave them a little bit of independence, but it's not a permanent use. It's always intended to be temporary, whereas the short-term rental in an accessory building doesn't have that same temporary parameter put on it. And I would also suggest, based on your comment there, you are running a bed and breakfast essentially. So you're owner occupied and you are renting out a room in your house or some portion of your house for a short period of time, but that would be a bed and breakfast, which is permitted under the existing bylaw and will continue to be permitted under the new bylaw. And those provisions have not changed one little bit. We're just carrying them forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Do we have anyone else? Okay, Mr.
I think Ross Cooper is trying to speak, but it sounds like it's not coming through. Am I the only one hearing that, or is that? Okay.
I don't hear it either.
So Ross, it's sounding like a Mickey Mouse voice or something. I don't know.
It does sound like Mickey Mouse.
I don't know. I'm sorry, Ross. Maybe try logging back in and we'll try to get you again. And it looks like Tracy Guthrie also has her hand up, Your Worship.
Find Tracy, if you will, please.
Hi, Tracy Guthrie. I reside at 9 West Street. It's just concerning the Airbnbs. I currently co-host and manage one that lives beside me. I run that place. It has 3 bedrooms. There is never more than 6 people there. We've never had a complaint from anybody on our street. We bring in a lot of tourism. We monitor everything. There is house rules and people abide by them. I've never seen anybody, even at the other 2 that I care for, not abide by the rules. Everybody comes from out of town and they bring, their family. They come to go boating on Georgian Bay, visit our restaurants, visit our downtown at Penetang on the waterfront. Like, they visit the theaters. So we have no accommodations in Penetang. So you're going to send them to Midland and they're going to wake up there and they're going to shop there. They're going to have breakfast there. They're going to probably have supper there. So as a taxpayer myself, I understand that other people may not like these Airbnbs, but I also pay taxes. And so does the person beside me that owns this house that I run. These are incomes for me. I'm not someone on welfare. I'm not someone who is, using government assistance. I work. These are jobs. And I don't understand why being penalized for bringing in an income, and we monitor it. We don't rent it out on a whole, it's not booked all month long. And I understand because of COVID, that's probably affected it, but people are very good when they're there. Another thing I have to say is, it is a municipally maintained street, so paying taxes. Why is it that only full municipal services have to be there? Because this one is on a septic and its own water. It is tested yearly, the water twice a year, and the septic tank is constantly pumped, and we can have proof of that. So I would like to know why that property would be penalized for this. I can't hear anybody.
Alison, are you able to respond to this?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things here. The first is that there is a licensing bylaw process that is going on in tandem with the zoning bylaw review. And that licensing process, I am not involved in that. But when that takes effect, that will apply to all existing short-term rentals that are in the town. And that licensing bylaw can do any number of things, including it can require inspections, it can require certain proof of septic systems, et cetera, et cetera. So the licensing system can address many of those issues. But the distinction here between the residential area and us now suggesting the downtown and waterfront zone is that within these residential areas, there is also consideration for housing supply. And within the provincial policy statement, the province does require that the municipality maintain at all times 15-year supply of residential land that can be used for intensification and redevelopment. And that comes out of a very detailed process that the county and the town go through together, where they look at population projections, they look at how much land is needed to provide for housing. So there's the housing supply side of it as well. Now, that said, if somebody wanted a short-term rental in a residential 1 or 2 zone, they could go through a zoning bylaw amendment process where the specifics of the particular property that's being requested can be looked at, and it would also go through in conjunction with the licensing as well. So it's not necessarily that they're prohibited in the R1 and R2 zone, but they're not permitted we're not recommending that they be permitted as of right. So there is still an avenue, if a property owner wanted to, that they could proceed through the amendment process through the Planning Act.
Your Worship, I do notice there are a couple comments in the chat for Council to take a look at. And then we also do have Deborah Aldman, who's asking to speak next, if you will allow.
Who is asking to speak, Stace?
Deborah.
On Bosch Finchley, is that who we're looking at?
Mayor, I believe Deborah Aldelman has popped up with her camera on.
Yeah. She just may not be on your screen, Your Worship, because there are two pages, and that'll be a little difficult for you. If you toggle to the other side, you'll see there are one screen and then there's another screen, because we have quite a few people on this evening. Do you see her now?
I see Deborah. Okay, Deborah. Oh,
Hi, yeah, I'm an owner of an Airbnb, and we also use it as a family dwelling. So I'm part-time up in Penetang. And yeah, again, there's people in place to either I'm there or there's always someone there to oversee it. So it's strictly, so there's not issues like that. And also the number of people is limited to at the most 8. There's just 4 rooms. So I'm just wondering, like I saw in the policy suggestion, was that, or the bylaw, that it should only be 4 rooms, which seems reasonable. And the other thing is, I don't understand what is meant by downtown and waterfront, and what's R1. Is there any place where we can get information about what those areas, what are those designated areas?
may I ask what your address is, Deborah, please?
It's 56 Water Street.
Okay, thank you. Allison, do you have a response for Deborah?
I do. So the residential 1 and the residential 2, they're 2 different residential zones. You'll see them on the zone schedule. They are yellow in color. And then the downtown and waterfront zone, it's another quasi-commercial zone that's being applied to the essentially the downtown area of the town of Penetanguishene. And if you look at the zoning map in the back of the draft zoning bylaw, you'll see the area that applies to. So right now, what we're recommending is that on a go-forward basis, the short-term rentals would be permitted as of right within that downtown and waterfront zone, but they would not be permitted as of right in the residential 1 zone or the residential 2 zone.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Stace, do we have anyone else?
Your worship, it does look like we have Ross Cooper back as well. And
Ross.
And
Okay.
hopefully his voice is fixed, but also I would like to make sure we do read the comments in the chat. So at some point for the record, it can be after Ross is done speaking, and you can I can do that for you at some point as well. I just don't want us to forget.
Okay, with that, Madam Clerk, we will go with Ross, and then following that, if you could read what is in the chats, okay?
Thank you. Can you hear me properly now?
You're good now, Ross. Go ahead.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. My comment just relates to the downtown and waterfront. If zoning exceptions have already been identified, then I apologize. I haven't looked at the map recently, but I had spoken with Andrea and had sent her information. When I looked at the chart that identified the uses under the DW zoning, there were some items that were left off that were previously covered under the commercial general. And that related to primarily to multiple dwellings. That would be a duplex or triplex, possibly row houses or townhouses. And I know that there are obviously within the DW zoning currently several of those buildings that have multiple dwellings. So there's the property next to me. I'm at 12 Tessier, by the way, I apologize. That's Ross Cooper and 12 Tessier. So my neighbor building has, I believe, either 3 or 4 units in it. There's obviously the main apartment building that's on the main street. And then there's also the apartment building between our place on Tessier and the restaurant that's on the main street. And then I'm sure there's other apartments on the main street. So I'm just wondering how the zoning bylaw will be adjusted. And I'm hoping that this happens obviously within this planning and prior to the new zoning bylaw going into play, so that we don't end up having to go through a bunch of changes. But are those things being reflected? And maybe this goes to Allison or to Owen. Are those exceptions being identified in the DW zones or the zone?
Allison, comment?
Yeah, I have spoken to Andrea about that, and we're aware of that, and that will be scooped up, and that will be part of the modifications that happen after this meeting. We didn't want to start and make some modifications and have too many different drafts of the bylaw floating around out there.
Okay.
So there'll be one wave of mods that will come forward in April, and that will be included with it.
And then Allison, at that point, we'll have an opportunity to review that and comment on it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
So Stace, I do see that we have a number of remarks in the chat room. So perhaps if you would want to go through those with us now and also indicate the addresses with them.
We do have another member. I don't know if you wanted to address Den Bosch and Finchley. Before I read the comment, there is another member of public that wants to speak, but I'm happy to start with the comments if you prefer. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, we'll hear Ms. Dan Bosch first, and then you can carry on. So.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. My name is Robert Barber, and I reside at 9 MacArthur Drive. I have written to council, to yourself, in fact, as well as to your committee with several questions. But I'd like to just get some response from Allison, if you wouldn't mind, on the high level. First being the requirements for the 15-meter setback from high water marks. As I pointed out, many, if not all, of the structures that date back to maybe the first or second generation of build will be non-conforming. Will there be a consideration for grandfathering these structures?
Allison, if you could respond, please.
Yep, absolutely. So this applies across the bylaw, actually. Any use that was constructed legally and is legal now will continue to be viewed, if it is no longer in conformity with the new standards of the new bylaw, it is viewed as legal non-conforming. So that means that in all respects, it's recognized that it was legal prior to this new bylaw coming into effect, and it continues to maintain that legal status. It's just simply recognized as legal non-conforming.
Thank you for that. Three other questions. First of all, clarification to the cumulative measurement of a shoreline structure. So for example, if there's a platform structure that has a dock attached to it, is the cumulative length of that structure the greatest width of product, or is it a combined width of product?
So it's a combined width of product. So what we're saying is it is of the entire shoreline frontage, 25% of that can be occupied by structures, whether it's one structure, three structures, what have you. But that 25% is cumulative. So 75% would not be occupied by structures, whereas 25% may be occupied by structures of the shoreline.
I understand that, Matt, but for clarification, let's say we have a platform on the shoreline that's 20 feet wide, and attached to that, but in parallel to that, in other words, perpendicular to the shoreline, but within the dimensions of that platform, extends out the allowed 30 meters and is within the allowed width. Is the cumulative width of that the benefit of the shoreline structure, taking up less than 25% of the shoreline, of course?
So if I'm understanding the question you're asking me correctly, if you have this platform that is, say, that's 10 meters wide, just for arguments and round numbers sake. And then you have a perpendicular structure that's attached to that, but it's only 8 meters wide. I'm only concerned, or we're only concerned with the 10 meters. So if you have something that is of a lesser width that is somehow attached, then we're looking at that 10 meters as being the outside measurement.
Great, thank you for that. The other thing that doesn't seem to be clear in all of this language is the definition of a structure, whether or not it's considered to be permanent or seasonal. So as everybody knows that's on Georgian Bay, there's many dock systems that are seasonal. This amendment and the accessories shoreline structure information seems to be addressing permanent structure. Is that the intent, or is it any and all structure?
So two answers to that as well. The first is that the Ontario Building Code, if a building permit is needed, it has its own definition of structure. And of course, being a provincial document, that would supersede anything that we have at a municipal level in terms of the definition. But we do have a definition for structure in the bylaw, and that is anything that is erected, built, or constructed of parts joined together, or any such erection fixed to or supported by the soil and any other structure, and includes a dock. So it doesn't have to be permanent. It being permanent is not a requirement of the definition as we've got it in the bylaw right now.
So it could be either a permanent or a seasonal structure.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, good. One last question, and I know it's a little open-ended, and frankly, that's the most concerning to myself, is what are the other considerations that was point 3 in your recommendations to council? What are the items of topic on that? There's many that are contained in your accessory structures, width of boat ramps, number of docks, number of docks, I think is pretty clear. Number of boat lifts. There's many items in here.
Yes, exactly. And that was just to characterize all of that. So that was the one comment that we did receive through the public meeting, was that perhaps that could be simplified down, because in these zoning regulations, we've talked about maximum areas for platforms and where they can be placed. And we've talked about that for gazebos and saunas and hot tubs. So we've got individual placement requirements and size maximums for each of those individually. So as a project team, we're committed to going back and looking at that and seeing if there isn't some way we can simplify all of that to take away some of the complexity.
Because as it reads now, it's a little confusing. It says one dock, boat ramp, boat lift. So to me, that means I can have one of the 3, and I'm not sure that that's your intent. I suspect not. And also the reality of one dock, I think we all understand and agree upon, but boat lift, for example, as long as it doesn't exceed the cumulative width and it's attached to the dock the way you've described it, I'm not quite sure what the disadvantage of that is. It's, as I pointed out, the invention of the boat lift and marine railway has taken a lot of the navigation safety risks off of moored boats, in the middle of the night. Not exactly ideal. The ramp width of 2 meters is totally impractical. No boat in today's world is 2 meters, maybe 50 years ago, but not in today's world. So that needs to be reviewed. I think as long as there's some common consideration for, as you pointed out, today's reality versus a 20-year-old bylaw, certainly things have changed. So those are my comments, and thank you for your reply.
Okay, thank you for the feedback. Definitely, we will take that with us when we go back and look at this section following this meeting.
Thank you, Robert. Now, Stace, I noticed that there are quite a number of response in the chat. So I think we will go there now.
Okay, I'll get started. Not everyone has listed their address, so I'll ask that anybody who's commented maybe add that after the fact if they can, but I'll just get started. Kim Bellimer, and this was a little while ago, so a lot of times these comments are coming in context with what we're discussing in the moment, but she stated, it sounds like the owner of Airbnb are the same, if the owner of the Airbnb are the same home or close to the area being rented, it's much more controlled. And she'd be happy, she said, I'm happy to hear that. Sean Olette said, I agree with Tracy and I offer the same question. If my property can support an accessory dwelling unit, then why limit to service lots? Zoning bylaw amendments are expensive and time consuming. And then Carol has stated, as an Airbnb host in my home, a large percentage of my guests come for work or school or non-leisure activities. There has never been any problem with unruly, disrespectful guests. What does it cost to get an amendment to the zone? What would the license fee be? Sorry, just delicate. Sean Olette noted, I would like to see short-term rentals, etc., open to rural zone properties as well. They are usually larger lots. And Deborah Alderman said, I'll also offer short-term rentals for a couple of months to professionals and students. And then Tracy Guthrie's noted, how do you determine if guests in our homes are friends or paying guests? Will the bylaw have the right to enter a property arbitrarily to decide the use? This is an infringement of our rights. Would this not cost the town for monitoring the property? And then Sean Olette stated, does a seasonal dock need a permit? No, so it may not fall under the bylaw. Making sure, and then Tracy said, gladly would pay for a license fee for a short-term rental. We shouldn't be penalized for buying in the rural zone. And then Sean added his address for the record.
So thank you, Madam Clerk, for those. And do we have any other members of the public that would like to make a statement or ask a question? There does not appear to be. So
Sorry, excuse me.
Yes.
Sorry, a little trouble with the unmute. Mike Mance from 13 MacArthur.
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
I would like to reiterate a couple of items from the shoreline structures and the water-based structures as well. There is a lot of detail there beyond the one dock, as was mentioned by a previous, by the Den Bosch, Rob Barber. And so I'd just like to understand, why that's so, why we have, since we're now proposing a 25% limit on the structures along the shoreline, what does it matter? How many docks you have, how many lifts you have, what's the size of the dock, the square footage, and so on. I just think that needs to be removed. If your intention is to change the bylaw and add this 25% limit, then there's no need for all those other limitations. I mean, 15 meters, how has it gone so long that legally there's all these structures along there that are 15 meters within, that are within the 15-meter parameter? I mean, that's 45. I mean, I'm an old guy here. I mean, that's 45 feet. That's a lot of structures to include into this 25%. That's a lot of structures that exist today that, I just don't understand how this 15 meters has been there so long. Maybe that needs to be updated and reduced. And then we bring up the topic of climate change and water levels and so on. Has there been a proper environmental assessment done? I mean, we use these words now as, you know, secondary things like rights to do things under the name of the auspices of climate change. You have no data. There is absolutely no data here to conform to make any of these kind of changes. The water levels in 1985 were very high. They were high last year. They were also very low in 2011. I mean, why do you have a limit on the size of the dock and the length of the dock? So some of these things you're bringing over don't even seem to be necessary.
Okay, Allison, you have a response from Mike?
Just at this point in time to say that you know, some of those standards that are in there are what have been carried over and have been in place. I don't know if since 2000, but have been are in the bylaw now. But that said, we are completely willing and happy to take a look at those shoreline structures requirements and to see if there's a way we can simplify them. But simply we take the comments away with us tonight to go and have another look.
Okay, well, I mean, I think I was asking very specific questions. Where did come the point about one dock, one lift, you know, with unlimited boats, the comments around the square footage of a dock? I mean, where is that data coming from? Where has that research been done to actually propose any of these things?
Okay, so again, without knowing exactly what specific sections of the bylaw, and I don't think this is the meeting where we get into the very specific sections of the bylaw, but a lot of what's in here, they are reflective of best practices that are used elsewhere in other municipalities and in comparable municipalities, as well as, you know, the very core things that are being carried forward from the existing zoning. But again, we take your comments under advisement, and it's something that we're happy to revisit and take a look at.
Well, I'd like specific data. I'd like you to present in some kind of written form when you say there's data from other municipalities that have implemented these kind of things. I'd like to see some specific data. I'm actually making an official request. This is not about comments. We're residents here of the municipality. We're asking for data because you're not answering the question. You're not, you know, I said one lift, one dock. That's very specific. I did say that specifically, and I'm looking for an answer to that. Where did one lift come from, for instance? That's in the document.
Well, Mike, as Allison has pointed out, your concerns have been noted, and they will be dealt with, and I'm sure that they will try to give you the information that you are seeking.
Allison, is that a commitment from you, or? I don't know. This is an interesting debate. Okay. Thank you.
I don't
know what else to say.
No.
Okay.
No.
Your worship? I think you're on mute, your worship. Your worship? I think
Your worship.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, your worship.
Okay, yes, I did see our CAO coming online. Do you have a comment to make in regards to this, Mr. CAO?
Thank you, your worship. I was just going to suggest that, as Allison's noted, certainly everything that we're hearing today will be taken back. This isn't the meeting to get into finite details of the proposed bylaw, but certainly all the comments that we received today will be taken back through our planning department and through Allison and her team. And we will certainly seek to get answers to folks that have very pointed questions and provide the relevant background information. And an example is such from the last comments we heard from Mr. Mance, Your Worship. So you have our commitment that we will certainly take all these comments back and seek to get additional clarity for folks that have asked.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. CAO. Do we have any other members of the public? Madam Clerk?
Yes, Your Worship. It looks as though Tracy Guthrie may like to speak again, but I do have an additional comment in the chat from Denise and Kevin McNabb of 37 MacArthur Drive. And their comment is, you stated that there will be a 5-meter setback from boundary for structures. For those on a narrow lot, this means the boathouse would be right in the middle of your property, which is not aesthetically pleasing. So it'd be, and then so Tracy Guthrie has her hand up if you choose to allow an additional question or comment.
Okay, Tracy, we will allow a second one. Go ahead.
Hi, I just want to ask, so if the short-term rental, these new bylaw laws go through and some Airbnbs don't qualify to continue to be an Airbnb. So for example, I have bookings way into December of 2022. I have a week here and there. Am I supposed to just go up and cancel those? Or are we going to have time to adjust to this different byloaning law or like byloaning law, or is it just going to be put out and that'll be it?
Allison?
Yeah, so the zoning bylaw, these requirements will apply in the future to new uses seeking to establish once the zoning bylaw takes effect. If something is in existence now and is deemed to be legal now, then it continues to be legal under the new bylaw. It's given that legal non-conforming status. The licensing requirements, when they take effect, they will take effect across the board. And maybe I could call on Owen, if you could just remind the people here at this meeting of what are the timeline targets under the licensing bylaw if they wanted to attend the public meeting for that, because those licensing requirements are what will really feed into the operation and the ongoing requirements of those short-term rentals.
Thanks, Allison. So maybe I'll just first elaborate on your point of the legal non-conforming use. So if you're operating a short-term rental use today under our zoning bylaw and you're doing it legally, that will be carried over, or in other words, grandfathered in as a permitted use, a legal non-conforming use in the new zoning bylaw. So it will still be permitted under the zoning. However, if the town does decide to proceed with the licensing bylaw, you will still need to obtain a license for that use on the property. In terms of next steps for our licensing bylaw, we do have an open house session on March 1st and March 2nd. I will put my email in the chat after this, and if anyone would like an invitation to that meeting, they can email me. It will be on Zoom. There will be a public meeting scheduled, we're hoping, for March 9th. And at that meeting, it'll be a similar process to this, where members of the public as well as council will have the opportunity to ask clarifying questions and provide their comments as well. And that is the process as of right now in terms of licensing.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Allison. Thank you, Owen. And Madam Clerk, does that complete our request for public?
I believe so. Oh, I do see Rita has put her hand up as well. You may not see it if it's not on your screen.
Yes, I see it.
Sorry. One final question. When you're speaking of licensing with regards to the Airbnbs, is there also going to be an additional property tax levy on our properties, or is it strictly a licensing format?
Allison or Owen, you have a,
I can answer that question. So staff and our project team who's managing the short-term rentals and the licensing bylaw haven't really gone into that much detail yet. So that's still something that needs to be discussed internally. It was identified as potentially an option in our report back in December, where we were given direction to hold further public consultation, but that's still a conversation that we need to have internally, as well as notifying public regarding that.
Thank you.
so I think that has wrapped up the public section of the meeting.
Sorry, Your Worship.
Yes,
Mr. CAO would like to provide comment, I believe. You may not have seen him on your screen.
I do see him now. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to reiterate that just for the members of the public that are listening and have a vested interest in the short-term rental licensing component, just reiterate some of Owen's comments and Allison's comments in that nothing has been decided yet with respect to short-term rental licensing. We will go through a similar process in terms of what we're doing right now with the draft zoning bylaw. One component in the zoning bylaw is short-term rental provisions, but there will be a dedicated public meeting similar to this, as Owen noted, intended for March 9th, as well as a couple open houses on March 1st, as well as March 2nd. And the goal is really to get feedback from the community, very similar to what we're doing here. So just wanted to be very clear that council has not decided anything at this point on short-term rental licensing, other than they want staff to continue to explore it, hold some public consultation, hold a formal public meeting, and return to committee and subsequently council with staff recommendations. So we appreciate all the feedback we're hearing tonight, and we would certainly welcome it again next week at the open houses, as well as the dedicated public meeting for short-term rental licensing. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Now, okay, with that, I am going to pass it on to members of council. And I mentioned to members of council that it's questions through either to Allison or Owen. And we're going to make sure that there are questions only. It's not comments, because council will have a lot of opportunity between now and the committee of the whole in April to do the comment part. So if there are any questions from members of council to either Allison or Owen. Councillor Levy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I simply wanted to ask either Owen or Allison, either one, how the provincial government's housing affordability task force recommendations will affect this, since they are saying they are going to take over our planning and zoning from us. And this wasn't mentioned tonight, and I think it's something that we should discuss. We don't have to have a big discussion tonight, but I'm just surprised it hasn't come to the forefront. So Allison or Owen?
I was just going to say, Allison, I will pass that one off to you.
Yep, no problem. So at this point, it's a little early in the stage of that process and to really comment on how that would impact this, as those are recommendations. And so the degree to which they filter down to the municipality at this point, I don't think we can draw any kind of conclusions as yet. But certainly from a staff perspective, possibly we can take a look at that and provide council with some thoughts on that. But it's a little bit early in the process to really say how that would filter down to this level.
Councillor Cummings.
Thank you, Your Worship. This question could be to either Allison or Owen. Where are we going to tighten up the parameters? STRs have a broad definition, and I think we need to tighten up parameters as to the actual definition of an STR versus an Airbnb and versus a VRBO and versus a bed and breakfast, and also types of buildings that they're allowed in, the number of people, if we're having inspections, those types of things, those types of parameters that we want to look for as a municipality. So we have something of the enforcement type for STRs. Would that be under your zoning bylaw changes, or would it be through the licensing program?
So some of that is adjusted through the zoning, addressed through the zoning. We do have a definition for a bed and breakfast in the zoning, and we do have a definition for short-term rental in the zoning. In the zoning, we do we should be indicating where they would be permitted as of right versus, by zoning bylaw amendment. So that those very basic elements are addressed through the zoning, but some of the more detailed questions that you asked are addressed through the licensing. So in terms of things like inspections, septic, various conditions of the license, that's all addressed through that licensing bylaw. The zoning, it really is honestly a blunt tool for this, but it really just sets the foundation, and then it's the licensing bylaw that really takes it the distance.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions, members of council? Councillor Wadebacher.
Thank you. This is a question for Allison. I think it was asked earlier, and I don't recall hearing the answer. And it had to do with the requirement that an Airbnb be on municipal services and not private services. And I was just wondering what the rationale was behind that. Thank you.
Sure. This was something that I had spoken to staff with a while back, and it's my understanding that there is no septic reinspection program in the town of Penetanguishene. So by and large, that it's a concern for those private services and how they're used, and if they're overloaded, for example, when somebody is using a short-term rental. So it had to do with the servicing and how those private services are maintained, et cetera, the state of them, how well they're functioning, and so on. So being on full municipal services ensures that the municipality has got capacity to accommodate those uses.
Councillor Wadebacher, did you have a further question?
Thank you. I appreciate the answer, and I was just curious whether that's something that might be more appropriately addressed through the licensing component for rural Airbnbs, as opposed to just restricting it outright in the zoning bylaw, so that perhaps on an if say if the licensing is on an annual basis, that if Airbnb is in a rural area, there needs to be some sort of either inspection or certification or something to that effect. I'll just leave that for discussion in the future.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wadebacher. Anyone else? Members of council? Councillor Cummings again.
Sorry, Your Worship, I forgot one thing. Allison, I didn't see rural residential included with the permitted uses. Is that going to be included with the downtown shoreline or waterfront applications?
Are you speaking in reference to short-term rentals? Yes, okay. At this point, the recommendation is only to permit them in the downtown and waterfront zones. So that means in the rural residential zone, any new short-term rental under that scenario would require a zoning bylaw amendment.
Okay. I just wondered why they're a little bit bigger lots. They're big farther out. I just kind of wondered why that would be.
It's the same concern with servicing.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else, members of council? Councillor Budebacher.
Thank you, Worship. My question has to do with the as of right secondary units in various forms of housing. In particular, as it gets into semi-detached housing and other multiples. You indicated that that's provincial policy, and I appreciate that. But with respect to lots that don't lend themselves to additional units, for example, say there's just not enough room for additional cars on a driveway because there is the requirement for parking and whatnot. So are there limitations that will come into play with respect to where these types of units, and I'm not opposed to them. I think it's a good policy, but it's not something that can be accommodated on every lot. There's some lots that you just can't do it because there's just not enough room for some of the other requirements. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So while they are permitted as of right in detached, semi-detached, and townhouses, they must still be able to satisfy all the other zoning criteria exactly for that very reason and for the land use compatibility and suitability reasons. So if, for example, they didn't have enough room to provide that mandatory parking space, either A, the additional dwelling unit couldn't go in, or B, the landowner would need to go in. In that case, it would be a minor variance to allow the unit without the parking. So they do have to be able to satisfy all of the zoning criteria, even though they may be permitted in that particular housing form.
Thank you.
Okay, members of council, anyone else? Okay, there being no further questions from council, I guess this portion of the meeting is now over, and I thank everyone for their attendance. And I will move on with the next matter before council, and that is a matter for consideration. And the draft zoning bylaw background to public meeting PL 2022-06, that this report be received for information and discussion, that the draft zoning bylaw be revised to remove short-term rentals as a permitted use in the residential first density R1 zone and residential second density R2 zone, and that short-term rentals be added as a permitted use in the downtown and waterfront DW zone, and that staff be directed to report back to council at the regular meeting of April 13, 2022 in response to comments received. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor LaRose and Councillor Budebacher seconded. All in favor?
Hello.
Councillor Cummings, did you have a statement or question? Or
I do, Your Worship. Just the town sent out a survey today regarding this policy change. Are all these comments coming from the survey going to be in this report from staff?
Allison or Owen, can you reply to this?
I can reply to that. The survey that was promoted today is in regards to doing our public consultation on the licensing bylaw, so the licensing portion of short-term rentals. It's not where they should be permitted in the town under the zoning bylaw. It is purely just regarding the licensing portion of that, which we will report back to council on at the March 9th meeting when we hold our public meeting for that.
Very good. Thank you, Owen. Deputy Mayor, Do you go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Clarification. At the top of this consideration report, it says to be received for information and discussion. But in the body, it says that the draft zoning bylaw be revised to remove short-term rentals, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to be clear that voting yes to this proposal would be only moving it forward for further discussion. Is that correct?
It is only for information and discussion, and you'll find that it will be directed back to staff to report back to council on all these findings.
Very good. Thank you, Your Worship.
Okay, last one before I call the vote on this. Councillor Levy.
Thank you, Your Worship. Am I muted?
No, you're good.
Okay, thanks. Further to what the Deputy Mayor said, I'm uncertain about the motion. I thought I heard that we were still removing short-term rentals from R1 and R2. So I would like the clerk
perhaps I could get some clarification from Allison or Owen.
I would prefer if we got it from the clerk, please.
Well, fine, we'll get it from the clerk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. The way I read that is it is providing direction to staff to make those amendments in that second part of the motion, make those changes. It doesn't mean that it's permanent. It means we're going to make those changes and then there'll still be an opportunity for finalization of the zoning bylaw. But certainly Owen or Allison or Mr. CAO can provide further clarification if that wasn't the intent.
Thank you, Stacy.
Okay, Mr. CAO, do you have further clarification on this?
Thank you, Your Worship. No, I would echo what the clerk said. It really, nothing is finalized. We're just looking for direction at this special council meeting to proceed with the removal. But at the end of the day, council's not endorsing or approving a bylaw right now. We're just looking for some direction to continue advancing the project forward.
Councillor Cummings.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a further clarification, should this not come back to committee of the whole then for discussion?
It will in April.
It says in this that it's directed back to council at our regular meeting. What does that mean? It'd be committee of the whole then, right?
It's a committee of the whole, yes.
I'd like it stated for that, if we could, just a friendly amendment.
Madam Clerk, can we make the change?
Absolutely, no problem. I think there's just sometimes when motions are created, council as a whole is referred to as council versus the actual meeting, because even though you're in committee of the whole, you still stand here as council. So I understand exactly what Councillor Cummings is saying, and I'll make that amendment. I'll change it to committee of the whole on April 14th instead of council, just for that further clarification.
Okay, thank you. Mr. CAO, you have a further comment?
Your Worship, I would just like to hear from Owen and or Allison, if you don't mind, just to be sure that that was just that it indeed can. There's no reason why it needs to be fast tracked. If Owen or Allison, if through Your Worship can comment, it's yes, very pointed there. So perhaps it was just perhaps we positioned it, as the clerk has noted, as council, but in fact it very easily could come to committee of the whole.
Okay, Allison, could you comment, please?
Sure. So I can't particularly comment on a staff report per se, but in conversations with staff throughout this project, it's my understanding that initially there was council direction that the short-term rentals should be in the R1 and R2 zone. That predates my involvement in the project also. So I think what staff are looking for here is that redirect from an earlier direction that goes back a couple of years. But correct me, please, Mr. Lees, if I may correct in that, please feel free to correct me.
I see that Owen has come on screen. Owen, do you have a comment?
I just echo Allison's comment is that I wasn't actually with the town at that point when that recommendation was brought forward, but that's my understanding as well, is that there was previous direction to have these permitted in R1 and R2 zone. However, it's been some time and staff wanted a little bit of direction in terms of changing that.
Your worship, I would just Owen, and Allison, just looking to ensure that there's no reason that this needs to come to council in April and that we can bring it to committee of the whole in April and council in May from a timing perspective. Just looking for some clarity, Owen and Allison.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no reason. Great. Okay.
Committee of the whole is just fine.
Okay. So we're good
Thank you,
then,
Worship.
Clerk, if you want to change it to committee of the whole in April, that would be good. So with that, members of council, are we all in favor? Good, carry. Moving on to question period from media and public, and I would probably caution if there are any questions that they not be repeated from tonight's meeting, that there be a new question if any. And there being none, then I would ask members of council if they have any announcements or inquiries. There being none, then I would ask for a mover to adjourn. Councillor Cummings, the seconded Councillor Levy. We are adjourned. Thank you, members of council. Thank you, staff and public for having